Hello, my name is Thomas Merrett. I'm a sculptor. I'll be demonstrating and talking through the process of reproducing a portrait bust in marble from a plaster cast using three different methods. I was approached by Emma Payne to carry out this project where I took one of my own sculptures, a portrait bust of a friend, a painter friend, and I made a mould and reproduced it in plaster 3 times so that we could record 3 different methods using pointing machine, the second one using calipers, and then the third just by eyeballing from the cast to the marble block. Emma recorded the whole process after each day of carving because originally these were big cubic blocks, and she recorded how the blocks, became smaller as I found specific points. So I'll demonstrate the first method, which is the pointing machine. I'll just move that out of the way. So this is the plaster cast. So this was a mould taken from the original, which you can see in the background. So obviously at the beginning it was a much more cubic, large piece of stone, piece of marble, but now we're a few weeks down the line, so some of the details there now, and some of the many points have been found on the face, so you can start to see this looking like this. For a long time it was not very recognizable, but to demonstrate how you go about using this method and finding a point, I've got this machine here which was invented in the 19th century, which you've got this, well, in this case we've got a wooden support and a brass arm which has got these hinged joints, so you can find any fixed point in space using this, and you tighten these bolts and these nuts to locate a point. What's quite important is that you have these 3 fixed points on the original, on the plaster cast, which relate to 3 fixed points on the marble. So they're in exactly the same spot. So if this frame is set up so it fits on the cast and it goes on exactly the same point on the marble, you know that when you find any point in space with this and it's fixed and doesn't move from one to the other, you know you're in the right shot. So it should be right. So to go about finding a point, you locate something on the surface, and you'll see from the photographs of it early on that you have to locate sort of extreme, the widest part of the portrait bust. In this instance, a lot of the points have been taken on the face, so what I'll do is locate a point that I haven't found yet. In this instance, I've just marked one in blue there. And what I do is I'll move this arm, lock these on, and then you go in as square from the surface as possible, find the point, like that, and then you tighten this here, and then when you pull that back, you take that off the cast, put it on the block of marble, and then when you put this up to the surface, you can then see by the distance from this to the brass knuckle there. On the plaster cast they touched, but on here there's a couple of millimeters from the surface, so I know that I'm still 2 millimeters high on that surface. So what I can do is mark on there. I've got 2 millimeters. I remove that, and I take a tool, and then you drill with a little chisel very delicately 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, and then you mark that point on there. And then now when I take that off that surface, put it on there, close up, and now they touch. So now I know that's right on the surface. So then it's a case of, once you've gone over a few areas nearby, you can see some of these points, they're quite, you find a point every time the surface changes direction. So you can see now there's several points in close proximity. So where I found that one, that one, that one, and that one, and now I found this one needs to go a bit lower. I can then carve using my eyes and using the chisels. I can start to render the form and start to sculpt it, joining those dots up. So at this stage, it's very much just tiny amounts you're removing, but at the beginning, it was much more using heavier chisels and heavier hammers. And the block originally was right out here, so there was a couple of inches to get rid of before I even got to that surface. So when I found a point up here, and I knew I had to go in that much, I'd have to remove large amounts of material. So in that instance, you might find a point and leave yourself a few, maybe 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters, just so you know you're not hitting in really, really heavily close to the surface. Marble has a tendency to bruise if you hit it too square on or too close to the surface, and it can damage the surface, and you might not see it straight away, but it can send little fissures through which will only show up when you start polishing. So you need to slowly sort of peel away the surface. You can see in some of the chisel marks, especially on the side of the body here and around the hair, these are the early marks of this big punch tool, pointed chisel, which removes the material quite quickly. And then as you go through, you get to more, the chisels get smaller or more delicate. Here's a claw tool, which is, you can see some of the marks there, the claw chisel. And then it's only at the very end that you use very fine sort of flat chisels or claw tools to just work the form and sculpt the surface. Around here you can see I'm starting to use little rifflers and tools like that just to slowly take off a little bit, because I'm very close to the surface by this point. So yeah, that's really it. I mean, once you found one, then it's a very laborious process. You have to, this is called a pointing machine, and you become a machine in a way. The skill is to not find too many points, just work out where it's essential. So in this, you can see, if you look closely at the model, you can see there's very distinct changes of plane, which is where you need to find your points. It wouldn't make sense to completely pepper this with points, because that takes away it takes away the artistry. You might as well use a machine or a computer-generated image to just reproduce it. So it's just trying to find a change of direction that will help you to then find that and then carve that. So yeah, that's method one. That's the pointing machine. I'll now change the blocks over and show you the second method. Okay, now moving on to the second method, which involves squares and calipers to take measurements. This is what I call it a box method, or I was told it was called the box method. But what I've done here is I've got this piece of wood, which is the same footprint as the block of marble, and the height is set up so it fits within the block. And I set this up so the top of the head fits perfectly with the block, so I didn't have to do lots of work of getting it down to that level. For this process, what I've got is a series of 1 centimetre, 10 millimetre gaps, or little sort of marks on here, to rule out all those measurements on both sides, and they correspond with the same, which are starting to fade, but marked out there. So what I can do is to find a point, I put my squares up. So one square. In fact, I'll do it this way. So if I'm finding, for instance, one of the first points I found, was perhaps on the nose there, but also on the cheek here, which was sort of square to the edge of the block and quite close to the surface. So when I put that on there, I can see that that's at number 10, so 10 centimetres from the front of the block. So I can put that on there. This is where you need 3 hands really, but we'll work with what we got. So at number 10, and then I take my calipers and I put that up to that point. So I've got my height, I've got my distance back from the front of the block, and I've also got my height from the bottom of the block. The bottom of the block is the top of that piece of wood, which you have to remember, otherwise you'll end up going too tall. I put the calipers on there so I can see that measurement, and then to transfer, I take this back and I find number 10. So there's number 10. Put the squares back on in that place, and I know I'm exactly the same distance back from the front of the block. Calipers are set to that height, and then I mark where that point is on there. So that's my height. I found my height. That point there to there. So to find its distance back from this side, I do the same. So I've got this front of this piece of wood relates to the front of the block of marble. So I know it's 10 back, so I can just take that measurement there, which will be the same as that 10 back there. Put that on there. Find that. The caliper's moved, which is always a danger. So what's important with this method is you keep everything square. If this moves out of square, then obviously it's going to shorten that distance, or if it moves that way, it's going to lengthen that distance. So here it's important to keep everything square. Find that point. And there. I mark that. And then back to here again, and then at 10, I put that on there. If I turn this, and what we've got is the distance back from the front of the block, which is on there, and you keep that on there as long as possible. This was obviously at the beginning, this was all one big side, but as I've started to work this away, all this is gone. But it's important to keep that there, so you've always got that side of the block, which is corresponding to that, where you take your measurements from. And once you've got your point fixed in space, you need to find out how far back into the block it is. So at this point, I'll put that square up on there, and then taking these dividers, I find the depth back, which is there. And then I'll put that back onto that. And then offering that up to that point, and then I can see by the side of this ruler that I've still got maybe 3 millimeters, maybe 2 millimeters to go in before I'm right on the exact surface. So I'll mark that, and then take a bit off. And leaving a bit of the pencil mark there. I don't have to do the whole method, the whole process again. I think that's probably about 2. And just double check. Yeah, and now I can see that that's pretty much bang on, maybe 0.5 millimeter, but we can get rid of that when we start to finish the surface. This process is much more laborious. I mean, you can just see it's just so much more things to consider. Whereas a pointing machine is set up for you, and you just have to move that arm, and you can rely on that. Whereas this method, each time you have to find another point, you've got to set this all up. Remembering where you are on this ruled edge, finding points. So because of the nature of it, you end up looking for less points. The pointing machine can almost influence what you do in terms of measurements. Because it's so simple, you can just find things so easily. So why not just check everything? Whereas with this method, it makes you use your skill a lot more, because you don't want to go through all that process. When you've found a point, and you found a point that works, and that you can rely on, and you found one there, maybe you'll find one there. The pointing machine, you might be tempted to find 3 or 4 between those points, but because this is so much effort, so much labour, you then you trust your eyes more. You think, well, I've got that one, and I can see the distance between is moving in a certain direction. So I can start to carve between those points, knowing that it certainly goes back, it doesn't come forward at that point. So if that point's there, I know I can confidently take stuff off. So it allows you to be a bit more confident, and also just rely on your eyes more and your skill, and read the forms more rather than relying on the machine. So I think I like this method better. I think it's much more freeing, especially for a piece well. This is a piece of my own sculpture, so it's something I've created. So it allows a bit of room as well for you to alter things. Whereas if it was a copy, maybe an architectural sculpture or someone else's work, the pointing machine might be better because it's a much more faithful reproduction. But yeah, this one's nice too. I'll move on to the next block. So moving on to the third method, I put the other block on here. So this is the third block in the third plaster cast. This method doesn't use any fixed points. The pointing machine, we had those 3 fixed points on the cast and on the marble. The last method, the second method, we had the square piece of ply, but which was relating to the block of the square block. Whereas with this one, it's more about just eyeballing it, using your eyes to carve the form, and finding points in space that you can then rely on. So as you can see, all the way down to the base it's been carved. So we haven't got any of the existing block then to copy from. The first thing to find on here, and this relates much more to my practice when I'm doing the original clay modelling, is about finding profiles, finding that front surface. So when this was a block, the front face of the block was there. So the furthest forward point on this whole sculpture is the nose there, the end of the nose. So my first thing to do is just finding where that sits in space. I'm using just the bottom of the block because it fits within this shape. But you could, if you had a taller block of stone, you could make the nose up here or down there. But because I'm not relying on anything else, once I've found where that is, then that's where things go from. I don't need to, if I'm finding that, I then use that point to measure from. So to find that chin, or to find the brow line or the hairline, I can work from this because I know that that's on the front of my block. So if you can imagine where that block was, that was the first thing I found. And then the thing I do next is I put that profile, that line of the profile, because on this face, everything is back in space, from that front edge. Everything else sits back. So I know that's my high point. So if I can get that right, then I know nothing sits forward of this, and I can start to cut away the block. So draw on the profile. So that's my center line, and you take that all the way down. Once I've got that in, and I've got it drawn on here as well, then I can take those measurements so I can find how far down that sits. There to there, there to there, so mark that on there. And then I'll do another one up here as well. So you are still relying on the calipers to find these distances, because I'm making it the same scale. If you were making it a different scale, you would just start carving and it would alter as you go. And then what I do is I look through the side, and then I start working away from that profile. Find a chisel. So these are set up in exactly the same point, same aspect. So I've got my front point there and front point there, and then I start to see how this nose moves back in space onto the bridge of the nose and back up to this point. And I can see in the block there's this movement back. There's that change of plane on the front of the forehead, and then everything goes back into the hairline. At the moment it goes up and carries on. So I know from that point there, which I've marked up there, things start to move back a bit quicker. So this method, by its nature, is a bit slower because you're more being a bit more analytical of each change in each plane. You're not relying on the pointing machine or on the front of the block to then measure back from. You're using something that's you found to create the next point. You sort of see that moves up and back. So when it starts to look like the right shape, then you know it's getting there. Once you've got one reliable point, and then the second reliable point, you can use them to find another. So for example, if I found where that brow is and where that is, the center line doesn't change. That's one reliable fixed point. I know where that is because that's where everything began. And then I found its height. So you've got one and the height, and I've seen how far it goes back by carving it back. And you can use those points then to find other fixed points in space. So maybe I could find where that eyebrow is and I've started finding where that one is by measuring back from there, and then that distance. So I know it sits there. And then I'll go back over and start to carve away from these points. So I know that sits there, and like in the last method, then you can start to turn the form and sculpt the form from one point to the other. When things become reliable and the more points you've got, you can then take measurements from certain things. For instance, to find the back of the nose, you've got that initial point. You can find your depth back in space, and then also your width, because you can measure off that center line. So taking the dividers and just eyeballing it from the front, you can see that distance back there to there. So when this was still a block, I would be able to draw on this fairly flat face, draw on where that is, and then just start cutting back in. And then I can measure from the front to know how far I have to go back into that surface before I hit the cheek. And then leave a bit. And you can see in the surface here, everything's slightly, it feels a bit inflated. Everything's still a bit too big because you're slowly peeling away the surface and finding these points as you go. Once you've got a few points that you rely on and you know their position in space is working, then you can use certain things to find that profile. So for instance, through along that center line where everything starts, you can find that movement back through there, and then you offer that up. What's important is that you start to find a few things. If you did it too early, you'd have no idea whether you're at the right angle, whether the profile's got to be, you might have it carved perfectly right, but if it's sitting too far back like that or too far forward, it's not going to work, and you have to carve it 3 or 4 times to find that surface. So yeah, I think this method works best for a project where, for example, this is something I modelled from clay, from life in the first place. So it's a form that I'm familiar with. So for me, it makes sense to use this method because I've already sculpted the forms in another material. So I already understand the way things are moving, and I know the person who sat for me, and I know how I sculpted it. So I can start carving it with the freedom, and there's room for interpretation because you can move it. If it was someone else's work, then I would want to find more measurements that I could rely on, so that I was sure that I was carving it more accurately. It's probably slightly less economical in terms of your time because you inevitably, you find something that is starting to sort of be in the right place, but you might have to take a little bit off, but it's not until you find something else that you can see that it's still too far. So you end up carving it a couple of times, whereas with the pointing machine, you can go right to the point and you know you're there. You just move on, find one there, and then you move on. And then once you've covered everything, then you can go back in and sort of comb over the surface and soften the forms. Whereas this, it's a bit more tickling it into shape, just finding those shapes. And you know, you can't just isolate something in space. The pointing machine, you could have a block and just carve that eye accurately. Whereas with this, you need to work the whole thing, sort of unpeel it. So that explains how the three processes are done. And here we have the three together. And you might not see it in the image, but if you were here, you could certainly see how each one has developed, you know, differently. The same amount of time was spent on each piece. You know, the same days were spent on each one. So they've had exactly the same amount of time worked on them. But you can see with the different methods how you can achieve a certain amount, you know, more quickly. So, for instance, with the pointing machine, the faces become much more finished. You can see the thinness of the face and the cheekbones and jawline. Everything's found right down into the neck. But you know, there's still quite a lot left in the back and also down in the bottom, which is essential for keeping the machine on. This one is much, you know, it's a bit further on. There's perhaps not quite the detail that you can get earlier with the pointing machine, but it's starting to get that thinness there and working down into the body. But you know, this has been left because of the block. The third one, it feels like it's still, as I explained, slightly sort of full because you're slowly peeling away the surface. But you know, there's a quicker opportunity to get rid of material because, you know, like down into the chest here and to the shoulders and into the back of the head, because once you found where something is, you know it's just got to go and you're not relying on anything else. So you just have to clear away material in order to find it. So I think the pointing machine is possibly the quickest one to find any detail or form. This method, I find personally that I'm much quicker at roughing the thing out, you know, turning it from a block into a more of the shape, because you have to work everything in order to see something. You know, you can't isolate anything in particular. And then this method is slightly in between the two because you're still measuring, but you're because it's sort of a laborious process, you're less likely to cover it with measurements. So you use a bit of a combination of the two. I think I would possibly, you know, in conclusion, I would say that each method really has a bit of each other in them. Pointing machine is kind of unique in that it does its thing. You know, once you set it up, it does a lot of the work for you. You just have to be precise and just keep an eye on where you're finding points. Make sure your things don't slip, because you're so reliant on it that if a point, and this often can happen, maybe gets a bit dusty and it doesn't quite tighten up, and as you close it up, it continues to move in. So you transfer it there, and you just end up going deeper than you mean to, because you sometimes switch off because it's so reliable. But these two methods, and even that, once you've found a few points that you can rely on, then you can use your calipers to measure from one to the other. You know, there might not be any point taking that measurement if you've got that one and that one, because you can measure across and find where it sits in space. So, you know, I think to say that once you start with one method, you can only use that, I think is you know, it's not necessarily correct. Once you've roughed it out, then you can start relying on your, you know, the fact that you do it and that it's part of your process and part of your skill. But yeah, I think in terms of this project, for instance, in doing my own work, it's a bit of a combination of all. I would probably set it up with this, but use it a lot less rigorously, and then rely on the fact that I know the subject to carve it more freely, as in the third stage. But obviously, if this was a piece of someone else's work or an architectural piece that had to sit in a precise setting, then the pointing machine would be the most reliable, because it might not be a familiar form, or it might have to fit perfectly. This gives you a bit more room to adjust things, but that might not be what your aim is. So this method is better. But yeah, I think each process has its place. and I think a combination of all three certainly is essential. I hope this goes some way to explaining the process and the three different methods. I've certainly enjoyed it, and it's been really useful for me to understand how each process gives you a different thing, or what you can find early on, or how long things take. So it's been really useful for me and informative, and hopefully it has been for you. Thank you.